In 1958, a woman named Margaret stood in a five-and-dime store holding a blue mixing bowl she desperately wanted. She didn't buy it. She walked home, set it on a mental shelf, and waited exactly 24 hours before deciding. That single habit, quiet and almost invisible, kept American families out of debt for an entire generation. Today, we buy in 3 seconds and regret it in 3 days. What did these women know that we've completely forgotten? If you've ever felt your cart fill up faster than your bank account, stay with me. Hit subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and let's uncover the forgotten rule that changed everything, because the biggest secret is still coming. The psychology of the pause. There is a moment right before a purchase when the brain makes a decision it doesn't even know it's making. It happens in less than a second. A jolt of dopamine floods the mind the instant an object promises pleasure, long before logic has a chance to speak. Neuroscientists call this the anticipation spike, and it's the same chemical reaction that fires when a slot machine lever gets pulled. Margaret didn't know the word dopamine. She didn't need to. She simply knew that if she wanted something too badly, too quickly, it was usually a trap. Her mother had taught her a simple rule passed down like a family recipe: sleep on it. If the desire was still there in the morning, it was real. If it wasn't, it was just noise. Researchers today confirm what Margaret's mother already understood instinctively. Studies on consumer behavior estimate that roughly 70% of impulses fade within 24 hours once the initial emotional spike settles. The want doesn't vanish because the object stopped being nice. It vanishes because the brain finishes its chemical reaction and hands control back to reason. In the 1950s, that pause wasn't a discipline technique. It was simply how life worked, because credit cards barely existed and cash was finite. You couldn't want your way into more money than you had in the envelope on the counter. That built-in friction protected families without them ever calling it a strategy. Today, we've engineered that friction out of existence, and something valuable disappeared along with it. The question isn't whether we still feel that same dopamine spike. We absolutely do. The question is whether we still have anything standing between the spike and the swipe. Modern advertising versus the 1950s kitchen table. Modern advertising is not accidental. It is built, tested, and refined by teams whose entire job is to shrink the gap between wanting and buying down to 0 seconds. Limited time offer, only 3 left in stock. Sale ends tonight. Every one of those phrases exists to bypass the rational brain and speak directly to the panic center that fears missing out. It works because urgency short-circuits patience, and patience was the one thing the 1950s household had in abundance. Picture Margaret's kitchen table on a Sunday evening, cash divided into small brown envelopes labeled groceries, church, doctor, shoes. There was an envelope for someday, and that envelope held the money for things she wanted but hadn't decided on yet. Nothing left that table without her husband's quiet nod and her own private review of the week ahead. There was no scrolling, no pop-up countdown clock, no algorithm quietly learning her weaknesses. If a purchase was still a firm yes after the Sunday review, it happened. If it had faded into a maybe, it waited another week. That single rule, if it's still a yes tomorrow, it's a real need, turned wanting into a test rather than a trigger. The modern translation of that envelope system is simpler than people expect. Many women today rebuild that same friction using digital sub-accounts, sometimes called spending buckets, inside their regular bank app, moving money for discretionary spending into a separate account each week and forcing themselves to transfer it back manually before buying.
It recreates the walk to the kitchen table. It recreates the pause. One small, practical, almost embarrassingly simple action available to anyone reading this. Unsubscribe from every retail sale email this week because you cannot resist an urge you never see in the first place. The dress shop window. One October afternoon, Margaret passed a dress shop window on Main Street and stopped cold. A pale green dress, simple, well cut, exactly the kind of thing she'd wear to her sister's wedding in the spring, sat displayed under the store's warm lights. Her hand actually reached for the door before she caught herself. She didn't go in. She walked home instead, turning the dress over in her mind the whole way. And that evening she opened the someday envelope on the kitchen table to see what was actually inside it. There was enough, technically, to buy the dress right then, but she waited anyway, out of habit as much as principle, and wrote the dress and its price on a scrap of paper tucked into her sewing basket. 3 days later, going through her closet, she found a navy dress from 2 winters earlier that, with a new belt and a shortened hem, looked almost as sharp as the one in the window. She spent 40 cents on the belt and an evening with a needle instead of the full price of something new. The green dress in the window never got mentioned again, not because she forgot it, but because by the time 3 days had passed, she genuinely didn't need it anymore. That is the entire secret hiding inside the 24-hour rule, expanded to its true form. Distance doesn't just cool a craving, it reveals options you already own. Financial freedom, one day at a time. Here is where the story stops being about willpower and starts being about the arithmetic. That 70% of impulses that quietly die overnight doesn't just disappear into thin air. The money behind those impulses either gets spent somewhere else or gets saved. And in the 1950s household, it overwhelmingly got saved. Multiply one skipped $5 item a week across a year, and you already have real money sitting untouched. Multiply that across a marriage, a decade, a lifetime, and you start to understand how families with modest single incomes still manage to buy homes, pay for weddings, and retire with dignity. Margaret's generation didn't call this compound savings. They called it not being foolish. But the mathematics behind those phrases is identical. The money you don't spend today is money that has decades to work quietly in your favor. Historians studying the post-war American middle class point to this exact behavior, patient, unremarkable, repeated thousands of times as one of the invisible engines behind an entire generation's homeownership. It wasn't a stock tip, it wasn't a windfall, it was a habit practiced at a kitchen table week after week without fanfare. Many of these women kept something called a wait-and-see ledger, a small paper ledger where they wrote down anything they wanted but chose to delay, along with the date and the price. Weeks later, they'd look back at that list, and more often than not, the item no longer mattered at all. That list became proof, written in their own handwriting, that patience had a price tag, and the price tag was smaller every single time. Wealth, Margaret used to say, isn't about what you bring home in your paycheck, it's about what's still there when the month ends. The clickbait brain and why we fail today. If the 1950s pause worked so well, why does it feel almost impossible to recreate today? The honest answer is friction, or rather the total absence of it. One click and the box arrives tomorrow. One tap and the payment splits into 4 easy installments you barely notice leaving your account. The entire modern economy is engineered around removing every obstacle between desire and delivery because obstacles cost companies sales, and sales are the only thing they measure. Compare that to Margaret's reality. Buying something meant getting the car keys, driving into town, parking, walking store to store during business hours that closed at 6, and often speaking face-to-face with a clerk who might ask what the purchase was for. That friction wasn't cruelty, it was accidental protection, built into the physical limits of the world she lived in. We no longer have those limits, so we have to build them back on purpose. This is where the 24-hour buffer becomes a tool rather than a nostalgic idea. The rule is simple enough to fit on an index card. Nothing non-essential gets purchased the same day it's discovered, no matter how good the deal looks in the moment. One woman who tried this for a single month, a working mother named Deborah from Ohio, said she added an item to her cart 9 separate times that month and only completed 3 of those purchases after the wait. The other 6, she said, she genuinely forgot she wanted within a day or two. She wasn't restricting herself, she was simply reinstalling the friction her grandmother had for free.
Grandma's Guide to Mindful Spending. Let's slow down and actually walk through a Tuesday morning grocery trip the way it might have looked in 1955. Margaret wakes before the rest of the house, the kitchen still cool, the smell of yesterday's coffee lingering faintly in the air. She sits at the table with a small notebook, a stub of pencil, and the previous week's receipts spread out like evidence in a case only she is trying to solve. She writes a list, not of everything the store sells, but of exactly what dinner requires for the next 7 days. This is intent, not appetite. At the store, she moves with purpose down aisles that don't scream for her attention the way modern packaging does, past shelves lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs rather than engineered lighting designed to trigger cravings. When something catches her eye that isn't on the list, a tin of imported cookies, a new brand of soap, she doesn't reach for it immediately. She notes it, mentally or on the back of the receipt, and lets it sit. That is the difference between a grab and a choice. A grab is a reflex. A choice is a decision made with the full weight of a family's needs behind it. This cooling-off period wasn't about deprivation. It was about giving emotion enough time to settle before it made a financial decision on her behalf. If you want to feel this for yourself, here is a challenge worth trying for exactly 7 days. Every single time you feel the urge to buy something that isn't a true necessity, write it down instead of buying it, and revisit that list only after a full week has passed. Most people who try this are stunned by how short the list looks by day 7. And even more stunned by how light their shoulders feel. The stop and wait wealth hack. Let's make this practical and fast because the numbers matter more than the sentiment. Multiple consumer studies place the share of purely emotional, unplanned purchases somewhere around 70% of total discretionary spending, meaning the majority of what fills a modern cart was never actually planned at all. The 1950s test for any potential purchase was almost embarrassingly blunt. Do I have a place for this in my home? Not do I want it, not is it on sale, but do I have a place for it? If the answer was no, the conversation ended there, because clutter itself was considered a quiet form of waste. There's a second, less obvious piece of wisdom hiding in this era that modern psychology now backs up completely. Decision fatigue is real, and it gets worse as the day goes on. By 6 in the evening, after work, after chores, after feeding a family, the brain has simply run out of willpower for the day, which is exactly why so many regretted purchases happen late at night while scrolling in bed. The old-fashioned instinct to avoid shopping after dinner wasn't superstition, it was self-protection against a tired mind. The modern version of this tool is almost too simple to believe.
Build a 24-hour digital cart. Add anything you want to an online cart the moment you see it, then physically close the tab, close the app, and walk away. Come back exactly 1 day later and only then decide whether to complete the purchase. The item hasn't changed, you have.
How convenience quietly killed the budget. Somewhere between the main street of Margaretstown and the one-click checkout of today, convenience quietly became one of the most expensive things a family could buy. It doesn't feel expensive in the moment because it's disguised as a time saver, a stress reliever, a small treat that surely doesn't matter. But convenience fees, subscription overlaps, and impulse add-ons accumulate into real money that never shows up as a single dramatic charge, which is exactly what makes it so easy to ignore. The vintage answer to this wasn't complicated. It was a concept sometimes called making do, the quiet art of repairing, reusing, and repurposing rather than replacing. A torn Sunday dress got mended by hand under the kitchen table, under a single lamp, the needle catching the light, rather than thrown away for a new one. A worn cast-iron skillet, heavy in the hand and seasoned black from years of use, was cared for like a family member, rather than upgraded on a whim. This wasn't about being unable to afford new things. It was about a value system that measured pride by what you could preserve, not just what you could purchase. The wardrobe carries this lesson especially well today, in an era of fast fashion, built to fall apart within a season by design. Choosing fewer, better-made pieces and mending small tears instead of discarding garments isn't just thriftiness, it's a return to deciding what enough actually looks like in your closet. Breaking the convenience cycle starts with the same 24-hour rule applied everywhere else. Before replacing something that still technically works, wait a day and ask honestly whether it needs replacing or simply needs repair. The result, more often than people expect, is a clearer mind, a fuller closet of things you actually love, and a noticeably heavier wallet at the end of the month. The discipline of the 1950s housewife. It's easy, from a modern distance, to estimate exactly how much financial skill ran through the 1950s household, quietly, without a title or a salary attached to it. Margaret was, in every practical sense, the chief financial officer of her home. She managed a fixed income, allocated it across categories with almost military precision, absorbed unexpected costs without panic, and still found a way to put something aside for the future. Patience, in her world, wasn't a soft or passive trait. It was a visible, respected form of discipline, the kind neighbors quietly admired and other mothers tried to imitate. Waiting a day before a purchase wasn't weakness. It was proof that she was in control of her money instead of the other way around. The modern equivalent of her discipline doesn't require an envelope system or a Sunday ledger, though both still work beautifully. It can be as simple as a free browser extension that blocks one-click checkout buttons on major retail sites, forcing a manual, deliberate confirmation before any payment goes through. It can be a banking app that requires a second approval step for any purchase over a set amount. The tool has changed. The intention behind it hasn't moved an inch since 1955. The real test, the one Margaret would have recognized instantly, is asking a single honest question about anything sitting in a cart. Will this genuinely improve my life next month, or does it only feel good for the next 24 hours? That question, asked consistently and answered honestly, quietly separates the women who build wealth over decades from the women who simply spend it as fast as it arrives. And that question is about to matter more than you think, because the biggest piece of this puzzle is still ahead. The big reveal. Why your cart is full, but your wallet is empty. Here is the part almost nobody talks about. the piece that changes everything you've heard so far. An abandoned online shopping cart, the kind retailers spend millions trying to recover with follow-up emails and second-chance discount codes, is not a failure. It is, in the truest financial sense, a win, and possibly the single most powerful habit hiding inside this entire story. Every abandoned cart represents a moment where the pause actually worked, where the 24-hour buffer did exactly what Margaret's kitchen table envelope did 70 years ago. The 1950s equivalent of the online cart was the mail-order catalog, thick as a phone book, sitting on the coffee table for weeks at a time. Families would circle items in pencil, dog-ear pages, discuss purchases across multiple dinners, and often never send the order form in at all. That catalog was the original slow shopping tool, built entirely out of the simple fact that mailing an order took time nobody could rush. If you want to feel the full financial weight of this, try an experiment for 1 month. Every time you add something non-essential to an online cart, close the tab immediately and leave it there for 24 hours before deciding. At the end of the month, add up the price of everything you never went back to purchase. Most people who try this are shocked to discover what could be called their personal impulse tax, often hundreds of dollars a month quietly spent on things that, given even 1 day of distance, they no longer wanted at all. This is the real masterclass hiding underneath every rule in this video. The impulse itself isn't the enemy, and neither is the item sitting in the cart. The enemy was always the speed, the total absence of any gap between noticing a want and satisfying it. The moment you reinstall that gap on purpose, the impulse loses almost all of its power over you, exactly the way it lost power over a woman standing in a five-and-dime store in 1958, holding a blue mixing bowl she wanted very much and chose, quietly, to leave behind for 1 more day. Margaret bought that mixing bowl eventually, 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, when she found it marked down and still just as useful as she remembered. She used it for the next 30 years, and her daughter still has it today, chipped at one edge and completely irreplaceable. The bowl was never the point. The pause was. What these women left behind wasn't a budgeting trick or a vintage aesthetic to admire from a distance. It was proof that financial peace has very little to do with income and almost everything to do with the small, repeatable moment of choosing to wait. You don't need an envelope system, a mail-order catalog, or a kitchen table from 1955 to reclaim that peace. You need 24 hours and the honesty to ask whether tomorrow's version of you will still say yes. That is the forgotten manual, and now you're holding it. Do you think families today would save more if they went back to the 24-hour rule before every purchase, the way our mothers and grandmothers did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this brought back a memory of your own mother or grandmother at the kitchen table, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of forgotten wisdom. Give this a like if it made you think twice about what's sitting in your cart right now, and share it with the woman in your life who needs it today.